because I think about racism and I think about primarily the sort of dictionary definition, which is I am superior to you because of the color of my skin. And when you apply that filter to it, a lot of the stuff out there that I think society would accuse of being racist maybe is not so much, unless you understand the context of what that means. Because I think that, I don't know, I guess I was going to say, I think that words like you're a racist or you're a Nazi and stuff get thrown around a lot at the moment. And if you run it through the filter of, I don't think my race is superior to yours, then they're wrong. But if you run it through the filter of some of the things you've written about institutional racism, then maybe they're right. So maybe we should take a half step back and just get you to talk to us. I mean, that's what your dissertation was in racism and anti-racism. Maybe we should take a half step back and have you explain to us from an academic and scholarly point of view what is racism.
Yeah, I think there is this dictionary definition is one that often gets in the way for us to get the work done. I think, yes, of course, it is racist if you come out and say, I think my race is superior to yours, and therefore you should have less, or you should have something different, like being segregated or not being allowed to live. That's obviously very clearly a form of racism, but I think we need to look at it in its historical continuity. So to see in history, when we had very clear overt examples of racism, what did they look like and what were the particular logics that they had in common, right? So having lived in different countries, and I grew up in Germany, I think we in Germany have a very clear understanding what racism is. That's very confined to a particular period in our time, in our history.
Yeah.
And I think Germany has similar struggles of trying to understand why suddenly we need to talk about all these other forms of racism that also are very prevalent in European countries. So what I like to look at it as how do we get to the point that we make other humans less human in the eyes of the majority, right? And that is, in academic language, we call that racialization, right? Like white people are racialized white and Black people are racialized Black. Like this is a process of making meaningful these categories that we put on people. Because we can have categories that don't indicate a hierarchy, right? Like we use categories. I'm not saying, all categories are bad, but when you use a category to distinguish yourself from somebody else in order to make them less than you, in the context of racism, we do that with the category of race, and the process is considered racialization. And racialization has changed over time. We know certain groups, depending on context, move from one category to the other. And it's never been a strict line between what this is and that is. This is why these systems that were very overtly racist, like apartheid, like the Nazi system, like segregation, they had to create these constant laws that they had to uphold. Right? And for every law that you made exceptions to that law. So we know based on these exceptions that these categories were very fluid. You can go in and out of some of them. There was differences between different groups again. So again, if you look at apartheid, there was, a whole category of the different non-whites people and what they could and what they couldn't do. And we see something similar in New Zealand of how colonization brought these ideas to this context and used it on the indigenous population. And then of course, as time progressed, also on other populations that then came into this country afterwards. So I think those are for me really important considerations to have. So when people say racism is only if you declare yourself a white supremacist or you declare yourself a Nazi and you just want to beat people up in the street. And I said, well, if that was the definition, then very few people will come forward and actually own up to this.
Yeah.
But it would also always require us that the people have to self-identify. So they have to self-identify as a full-fledged racist versus a non-full-fledged racist, whatever that might look like. And that's really also the question around intent and impact.
Yeah.
I think while the questions around what does it mean to be a racist might, require a lot more time to unpack, what is really easy to unpack and what's really easy to assess is what is the societal impact, right? And again, in this country, there's evidence after evidence and report and research and historical accounts of how Māori have been dispossessed and marginalized and continue to be discriminated against institutionally in a number of ways. right? So let's look at the impact, and we can see this impact now also with other minority populations. But I think in this context, it's really important to understand what's the context that we live in. This is the settler colonial context, and even people like myself and other people of color, we live on what is Maori land. So we, no matter what we do, are also complicit in that process in some ways. So I think these conversations get more complex as you move them from context to context, but it doesn't mean that they're in isolation from each other, which is why people show up for Black Lives Matter here, not because we're just thinking this is an American problem, but because people are actually connecting the dots, and people are looking into the history and saying, oh, here's how some of this keeps going. And it's, yeah, maybe changed, some of it may be improved, but there's continuity. And this morning on CNN, there was a reporting on some of the protest signs, and she was saying that there was a middle-aged Black man who was holding a sign that said, "I am a man." That was a sign that one of his family members had been holding in one of the marches during the civil rights movement.
Wow.
Right? So I think when people do something like that, they're really going back to these histories of resistance and trying to say, this is not an isolated event. This is not a failure of the few. And, you know, overall, we're doing really well. It's about saying, hey, this has been going on for a really long time. We need to do better, but we also need to acknowledge that there is historical harm. It's not just present harm. There's some real historical harm that needs to be addressed.